Hello guys, welcome back. So today is going to be the Morrigan and the silence. It's funny because somebody asked about an issue to do with silence before I actually started recording this video. And today I have been spiritually downloading the content that makes this video all day long, to the point where it kind of hurts to the back of my head now. And on top of that, I went and picked the Book of the Great Queen up, wanting a quote from it, opened it up, and it was on the exact page. So the Morrigan is very insistent on this being made. It was a little bit eerie, a little bit of a confirmation, which is always great. So let's just dive on in and talk about the Goddess Morrigan and silence. Subtitle, because I'm cool like that: Silent as the grave, the goddess herself. I know. I set that atmosphere. You loved it, didn't you? Tell me you loved it. I'm in a strange mood. Apparently, it's too warm. I'm in a strange mood. It's actually going to be a very serious video, so a little bit of levity to start with. A little bit of levity. So a title that I have associated with her for a very long time is the Silent Watcher, and I wasn't entirely certain where this came from, and I was having a look around it. Now, it may have come from Stephanie Woodfield's book. She may have titled her that in one of her pieces on that, and I was looking if there was like a mythology reference to it, and I couldn't find one. That doesn't mean it doesn't exist, because I am not a reconstructionist and my memory is shocking. So when I was trying to find that title, a lot of people do refer to her as that, but I couldn't find the mythological, you know, the word is lore from the mythology, but it's definitely something that's associated with her. And I'm going to explain it thus. Perhaps this title is best explained in her role, that being the Morrigan, as Phantom Queen. Moments of loud, piercing screaming. Divine... That's crows. I really hope that this microphone picked that up. Hi, Mama. I'm excited now. Moments of loud, piercing screaming, divine communication of warning or death, accompanied by longer periods of deathly silence, also called the morbid silence of the battlefield after the battle. And that I took from War Goddess, the Morrigan, and her Germano-Celtic counterparts by Angelique Guillemot-Epstein, 1998, dissertation. There is also the fact that the Morrigan, in her screaming, actually kills warriors. This is actually documented particularly well in her Guise of Navain. Oh, more crows. Please tell me the camera's picking that up. Fingers crossed. In her Guise of Navain. And this is from the Tainbo Clonage. Pronunciation is terrible, apologies. Navain attacked the host. 100 of them fell dead when they fell silent. Oh, and that's from O'Reilly's. I think it's O'Reilly as a translation. I will say here, before I go on to the more that I wrote here, that as the Silent Watcher, this is something I advise people about when they want to talk to me about the Morrigan, and quite a lot of people get offended by this, and I'm not entirely sure why. Please tell me that got on the camera. Come on, just come flying in the window at this point. This is surreal. Sorry, I'm super excited. It's really exciting when she does this. So something that I tell people about is that she will go silent for periods of time. She might come in like a tornado of dreams, synchronicities, messages. She might be very front and center stage, very aggressive, and then suddenly goes silent. Now, this is symptomatic of what we're going to be talking about throughout the rest of the video, but also it's a test, and the Morrigan does test people. And I think she kind of does that to see whether or not they can handle moments of very, very loud spiritual download versus times where you're on your own to learn the lessons, to digest them. And the through line of digestion has been from this week, and I did want to make this video to go up on the last day, Sunday, depending on some people are like Sunday's the first day of the week, but I'm just like, meh. It's always been Monday to me, but all right. So how we digest her lessons is those pregnant pauses of silence where she goes still and quiet and silence. And yeah, I'm getting chills. Hi, Mum. So I often advise people of that, and they do take offense, and I'm not entirely certain why that is. Some of them come back later and say, okay, it happened. It's definitely a thing. And then I'm like, oh, totally. In my best Virgo, I told you so. But not mean. I don't mean it badly. It's just, you know, when people get angry at you for telling them that, and then they come back like, oh yeah, it was a thing. And so there is also the silent pauses that punctuate the stillness before the frenzy that so typifies the energy of the Morrigan. The silent meditation before prophecy, the tense dull ache before battle is joined, and the echo of death when it is over, when it is complete. It is human nature to observe and understand the world in terms of opposition, which is kind of like how we justify warfare, by the way. The way that human beings justify going to war in any circumstance is by painting the other as the enemy, as less than, as evil. And you find that in literature all the time for very basic motivational points, that people believing that the other is evil for whatever reasons they've come up with of their own, to justify war or aggression or combat. To understand human nature in this way is an oversimplification of the world around and indeed within us. The categorizing of a life in search of meaning could be seen as being terms of being active and times of being restful, rest periods, which certainly follows the biological cycles of human beings and many other creatures who require sleep and rest. Argument can, of course, be made that we're always active, even in rest periods, with the automatic functions of our bodies and the unloading of our subconscious while in dreaming, and resting while in active periods, such as when we go on an autopilot, when the active brain, quote unquote, switches off. It doesn't really, but it's doing something on autopilot. Or when we take breaks from high impact forms of activity within our day-to-day lives. Some would call the only true rest or cease of activity to be death, which the goddess Morrigan governs. But anyone who has actually experienced other people's physical deaths will know it is far from silent. Before we move on to that, I'm just going to reiterate what I mean around these ideas and why I think they matter in terms of silent versus, I mean, that will become apparent, but I've wanted to really drive home the way that humans perceive the world around us. So when we're looking to perceive spirituality, we're looking to perceive and understand our place within the world, our relationship to divinity, whether we are connected within the spiritual ecosystem, looking for answers to the who and the what and the why of the world. And that's where sort of science and spirituality merge and mix for most of us. Most of us don't reject the way that we learn about the natural world. But for most of us, I think magic is kind of like the soul wire underneath it all. It's just my opinion, but you know. But that's a good example, actually, because a lot of the time people put things in stark opposition, as if they need to explain the world in terms of this is opposite this all the time. You know, you hit black, white, good, evil, etc. And science and magic are often put at two ends as if they're polar opposites. And that to me is not the case. They're more like this. They're meshed. And so when we are searching for meaning, then there are these ways of looking at how we expend energy in terms of being highly active and then rest periods. And that seemed to reflect, like I said, the biological cycle of most creatures on the planet, not all, obviously, in the broadest possible strokes. But at the same time, we must acknowledge that these polar opposites don't ever exist. We rest in periods of activity, we're active in periods of rest. It's just that a lot of it might be subconscious, like when we're dreaming and we're processing things without being monkey mind, waking mind, being aware of it. So there's that. Presumably, not even the morbid silence of the battlefield was ever truly silent, with the moans of the injured or dying, and likely the calling of the carrion crows making quite the impact on the psyche of anyone bearing witness to them devouring the dead. It's worth bearing in mind that crows were seen by the ancient Celts to be consuming the souls of the dead and carrying them to the underworld. So the literal, again, digestion of the physical incarnation of the individual was the means by which the crows would take on their soul and deliver it. Similarly, we as human beings are never truly silent. Even if we are, or perhaps cannot engage in speaking, so perhaps we're not able to, or perhaps not physically able to, do we not hear our own thoughts? Our lyrics of a song not easily caught between our ears? Do we not remember words another spoke to us in their dialect and tone? If we cannot hear through conventional methods, do we not experience sound as vibration? Sound then is instead on a sliding scale rather than polar opposite, the same way as human activity is, and does not either exist or not. Although it is a very interesting philosophical question as to whether or not sound exists when there is no creature to receive the vibration in receipt of it. I always love that as a debating point, and it's basically because there isn't an answer that really works. It is an all-encompassing yes or no answer. You can argue philosophy, which I love. I love that about it. Similarly, silence can also be seen to be passive or aggressive, an action or a reaction, a physical act to take against another to silence them, or an action of the individual, of utter empowerment, very personal, to choose to be silent in a situation. Like it's like taking your power, to how powerful it is to choose to be silent when they expect you to be enraged. I forget where that quote's from, but I love it. It has been defined, that is silence, in terms of strength and weakness by human beings. The judgment, of course, being a matter of perspective. So I'll leave you to debate whether or not silence exists in that philosophical thing. You can turn the video off and moan at me out loud and then turn it back on again. But I really do like this idea that silence has this all-encompassing energy to it as well. So it can be passive, it can be aggressive, it can be an action, it can be a reaction. It can be like, I am silencing this, or it can be, I am choosing to be silent. So what is silence then? By definition, it is the complete absence of sound. Interestingly, the root in etymology is silens, present participle of stillere, to be quiet or still, is of unknown origin from the 1200s. Other definitions of silence come after that point linguistically. Perhaps then, ultimately, silence is actually an auditory description for the unknown. It is a space in which we do not know what exists because it's beyond human perception, much like death. When we are thinking, we are silent. We are actually practicing stillness to enhance our perception of the world around us. We are seeking to understand, which is a proactive mental exercise. Moments of stillness are again when we digest, much like the crows on the battlefield. Physically, in terms of food or drink, the information and stimuli we have encountered throughout the day in our minds, or exploring the spiritual realms through our own excavation of self. We give meaning by our perception of the otherwise frenzied elements of life. So if the moments of stillness are when we take in, when we absorb, when we digest things that in that present moment we were too frenzied, too preoccupied, too busy to fully digest. In battle, a warrior distracted by external thoughts heightened their risk of death or injury. They had to be focused on the battle at hand and little to nothing else. Various resources have committed to history the necessity of focus and discipline, especially mental, in times of war. And there are many famous examples of this being the case. Guides to being a warrior, the art of war, Shinzo. So, and in the Morriganic myths, amongst others, of course, this is no different. The ideal of a brutal, animalistic aggression overtaking the warrior so he might perform to his peak potential, a form of frenzied bloodlust, is the very pinnacle of this idea. Warriors such as Morrigan's favourite Cuchulainn were capable of acts of perceived incredible strength, overcoming the odds, defiance of death to an outside observer, because of course the Morrigan guarded Cuchulainn's death and he would die when he was meant to. But they were perceived as being defiant of their death in cases of overwhelming odds because they were incensed this way by the Morrigan, such as the taunting of Cuchulainn by Bave. These myths can be perceived in multiple ways. Either to explain the rage present in a human by way of divine inspiration or divine necessity, or by them being possessed by the spirit of war herself, the Morrigan. One of the ways, outside of physical alterations to Cuchulainn's body, that fits this is the presentation of the almost otherworldly power and dissemination in response to his voice or shout. And this is where I grabbed the quote. It's from the mythology originally, but I have taken it from the Book of the Great Queen by Morpheus Raviana. And this is again, I believe, it's O'Reilly again. It shook his shield and brandished his spears and waved his sword, and he uttered a hero's shout deep in his throat. And the goblins and sprites and spectres of the glen and demons of the air gave answer for terror of the shout that he had uttered, and Nevain, the war goddess, attacked the host. And within this section, it's also talking about the idea of wordress, trance speech that occurs in battle with regards to the connection between the prophecy elements of the goddess Morrigan, the divine spoken word, and how they are rising from a sleep-like trance to give speeches, warriors giving speeches in order to overcome terrible odds, and so on and so forth. Right. And so that was the quote that I wanted from that particular book. So here, the stress, the emphasis in the case of Cuchulainn and other warriors too, is of those moments of really, really acute loudness of when they shout, and this tied into the death scream from the last video. But it occurred to me that the moments of silence are kind of like the punctuation marks of speech. We're never truly silent, I don't think. And even if we perceive ourselves to be silent, which we're not, we're more in a stillness, but let's say we were perceiving ourselves and we perceived the world in silence, someone else perceiving us and our actions would hear the noises we make, how we click our tongues when we talk, how we rustle around when we're moving, the shuffling footsteps and things. We are creatures of noise. We make noise all the time. We're not stealthy, generally speaking, and we can train ourselves to make a lot less noise. And there are some insane examples of people doing this throughout the years in different cultures, usually in warrior sects as well, who harness a camouflage and a form of silence, although I wouldn't say complete silence is ever possible, as I explained, because there's always someone around to perceive, and the higher their ability to perceive, the less likely you're going to get away with pretending you can be silent. So there is this interesting push, pull, tug, sliding scale that happens with our abilities to be silent. But there is certainly moments of stillness, and sometimes we are called upon to make noise, to shout, to scream, to say what we need to say, be very vocal. And then there are times when being silent, quote unquote, at least being still anyway, is of merit and benefit to us as people, as individuals, and especially if we work with or follow under the goddess Morrigan. And this is a lesson worth bearing in mind, even if you don't. That sometimes there is a strength in a non-response, in that silence. Like I said, sometimes it's all dependent on how we perceive silence. If we perceive it as weakness, as we perceive it as strength, and what different situations that we have decided merit those labels that we apply to the idea of being silent and to the idea of when we are not. When is it that we are called on to step into a warrior archetype under the goddess Morrigan, or perhaps a death archetype, because sometimes as a phantom, as a banshee, her wail, her scream, her warning cry would be heard, as some believe that Bave was the origin of the banshee, which we also mentioned in the last video. But other than that, the phantom would be silent, right? The phantom would be watching, it would be taking in information. It would not necessarily be passive, but more observative, more restful. And so these are two major archetypes of the Morrigan, which embrace the idea of sometimes being overt and loud and screaming and shouting and making a lot of noise, versus sometimes the need, the necessity, the balance, there's that word again, of quietness, stillness, silence. So what does this mean for us in terms of spiritually working with the Morrigan? What does that mean? Now, for me, I wrote a piece recently, which I shared with you guys, that was channeled on many levels. She was like I was like downloading it, like, I need to say this, I need to say this, I need, the Morrigan and her magic and prophecy role. But it came from this idea of the original seed of thought was, when am I choosing to be silent, and when am I cutting my own throat and like no noise is coming out? And the idea of cutting my own throat was very poignant under the Morrigan for a number of reasons, because one, it's doing it for other people's benefit, not one's own. So one is physically damaging oneself and taking away one's gift of voice, of power. Now, for me, the seat of my power is definitely voice work, and being a channel and speaking for spirits and deity. That is definitely one of the seats of, or the pillars of, or the gateways of my power as a witch. And so when am I sort of silencing myself when I should be speaking, and when am I correct in my assertion of when is best to be silent? Now, I've had a lot of thoughts swimming around my head for a very long time on the topic of silence and it being a strength. And here are some of the ways in which I think silence can be incredibly empowering for us as spiritual practitioners, and some different quotes that I really adore. Now, one of my absolute favorite quotes by George R.R. Martin that I say so many times, it's just, I adore it, is, "He who must say he is king is no true king." That is an expression of when a verbalization, a proclamation of self, is disempowering to all around. And another one that comes from George R.R., which feeds into that, is the idea of power. Where does power lie? And he gives the example from his books of a priest, a king, and a sail sword, I believe. And where does the power lie? Where a person believes it does. So there is no correct answer. The power lies in the power of belief, and the power that is put behind those archetypes from the individuals who are believing in the way this. And so then that really illustrates the point that where we believe power lies is where power lies. And so the ultimate answer to this question, that how do I overcome silence under the Morrigan, or in general, is find the power within silence. Where does that lie for you? I think there can be an incredible idea of empowerment through the idea of silence, from that notion that I mentioned earlier, which is when people expect you to be enraged of giving a response, and when you do not wish to speak, then you do not, because that is being self-contained. That is your power base, and you have every right to choose not to speak when you don't feel that you want to, that you are not comfortable in that situation, and when you do not wish to waste your breath, which is life force, which is power. And that is your choice. And then also look at when you feel silence is being, quote unquote, weakness in your idea of what those mean to be, because all of these ideas are literally and figuratively our perception of them, how we perceive the world around us, what we perceive moments of silence to be, when we perceive moments of silence to be empowering versus when we perceive moments of silence to have taken away our power, to have, quote unquote, weakened us, when we feel that we are in a moment, and for the sake of this video, we're going to continue with that warrior analogy. It might not always be the case of a warrior analogy, but we're going to continue with that as an example. So if you are in the battle of life, whatever that is, it doesn't actually have to be aggressive, it doesn't actually have to be a fight, but if you are in the battle of life and a moment of silence is strong, strengthening, hardening your resolve, making your senses feel more acute, making you more aware of your environment, you're less likely to take damage, you're less likely to be injured as a result of it. That is a moment when you're feeling empowered by it. But if instead you are feeling in that battle of life, again, whatever it might be, that the silence is actually turning deadly for whatever reason, it's unnerving, it's setting you off, it is not allowing you to feel empowered, then that moment of silence is instead draining you and taking away. So in that moment, you might need a little noise, a little banging of the fist on the spear on the shield to hone in your attention. And again, it's how you react to stimuli around you, and the world is never silent, as we've said. So it depends on how you are using that ability to channel your personal power into what it is that you are doing. And I will answer the very specific question that was asked on below the death scream video. Now, I have explained in one circumstance that a death scream does not need to be loud in order to be a death scream. You can have more of a silence, more of a pain, more of a scream, and I thought we'd just demonstrate it sort of so as best as I can without it being like full embodiment, because full embodiment would take time to rev up to that, and it would require, and basically I would be channeling pain, anger and things with nowhere for it to go. But I will walk you through the motions of it as a silent death scream. So for me, it would very much start in and of the body. It would very much start as a hunch and a pull, and that's almost the way that sort of almost pulls the energy out through the body. So it's a hunch, a pull, and an emotion, and that, and it's very silent in that it is not loud. It's not. It's more of an exhale, a thing, but there's a lot more power and venom behind it, and the screech might extend from the body. So that would be a more silent version of the death scream. But in response to that question, the underlying this is to look at when you feel empowered by silence, when you feel emboldened, strengthened by it, and make those weapons in your arsenal, to just keep going with the warrior archetype for the sake of this video. And so in those terms, the power is where you place it. The power is where you believe it to be. And then once you realize where you are placing it, where you believe it to be, you can adjust that, or you can embolden that, or you can keep that as a moment of stillness within your life. So I hope that helped, guys. I hope you enjoyed the video. Many blessings, and I'll catch you next time.